Ethan Matthews was 8 years old, and the story that would change his life began on a cold autumn dawn in 2021. 2 years earlier, he had lost his mother in an accident that still echoed in every corner of the house. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, wrapped in a plaid blanket, a crumpled comic book between his fingers. His wide brown eyes reflected the pages illuminated by the dim lamplight, but his mind wandered beyond the colorful adventures. The silent room, with toys neatly lined up in the closet, and the scent of old paper felt familiar and yet unbearably empty. He could hear his father's slow breathing in the next room, a rhythm that brought security and also memories of the past. Every creak of the floorboards made Ethan's heart race, reminding him that the house was still alive, yet something was missing. It was on that threshold between sleep and wakefulness that he sought refuge, trying in vain to drown out the echo of loss. Little did he know that night, the silence poised to be broken held far darker secrets. Before continuing, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss intense stories like this. There's a lot of heavy stuff coming up. David Matthews, his father, was a man of simple routines. He woke early to brew strong coffee, donned his worn coat, and tried to move forward as best he could. The bond between father and son was marked by a silent complicity, punctuated by drawings on scraps of paper and silly jokes. Before bedtime, when Emily entered their lives on a late Sunday afternoon, she brought a breath of novelty that lit up the living room with her easy laughter. She had an almost childlike, lopsided smile that spread to her eyes, and a sweet voice that reminded Ethan of a musical toy. Curious, he studied her every gesture as one might study a new character in a blank book. Emily showered his father with compliments, filled the house with flowers, and prepared colorful juices that seemed to hide promises of happiness. At first, the boy felt relieved. Perhaps this woman was the missing piece in his family's puzzle. Yet something in her gestures, a gaze that lingered too long, a held-back sigh when she thought no one was watching, sent a prickling alert through Ethan's chest. Without understanding why, he tucked these sensations away in a small box at the back of his memory, ready to explode at any moment. The next morning, the sun timidly peeked through the striped curtain, casting slanted beams of light across Ethan's insomnia-marked face. He descended the stairs with light footsteps, clutching his crumpled pajamas to his body, and found David in the kitchen, leaning over his coffee cup, eyes lost in thought. Emily appeared behind him, wearing a beige knit sweater and a smile that seemed sculpted for the family scene. As she served hot toast, she gently touched David's hand, then instantly shifted her gaze to Ethan, a quick, sharp look that made the boy swallow hard. In the corner of the room, the radio played a soft melody, but Ethan hardly noticed. He was focused on how Emily precisely dusted off her coat and the slight furrow of her brow when she thought no one was looking. Every movement of hers seemed choreographed to please, yet her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly when she picked up the knife. Ethan felt his chest tighten and struggled to breathe deeply, as his father always advised, but the air felt too heavy on that morning that promised normalcy. During breakfast, Emily spoke of weekend plans, a trip to the park, a snack at a new bakery, perhaps an afternoon movie, and David agreed enthusiastically, as if trying to erase the shadow of the past. Ethan forced a smile and murmured an almost inaudible, "Okay." When he attempted to ask about the bakery, Emily interrupted him with a soft laugh and changed the subject, talking about living room decor. The boy realized then that whenever he tried to join the conversation, she pushed him back into an invisible corner, as if he weren't welcome in that dialogue. Later, as he packed his backpack for school, he overheard Emily murmuring something down the hall. "He only gets in the way, don't you think?" The words were so quiet they sounded like wind through a crack, but Ethan caught every syllable. His heart pounded so hard it hurt, and he gripped the doorframe, unsure whether to confront his stepmother or silence that ache in his chest forever. Doubt took root inside him. Tell his father, and be seen as ungrateful, or keep the secret and protect himself in his own solitude. At school, Ethan tried to focus on his assignments, but his stepmother's words echoed in his mind like a persistent buzz. The teacher asked him to read aloud a passage from the book, but his voice came out shaky, almost inaudible. Some classmates laughed, and he felt his face burn. The truth was, Ethan no longer had headspace for geography or science. His thoughts were trapped at home, on Emily's figure, and everything she hid when no one else was around. He began jotting down in an old notebook what he saw and heard, tiny details that might perhaps help convince his father later. A comment here, a disguised shove there, a plate whisked away before he could finish eating. With each new note, he felt he was building an invisible shield, something that gave him strength not to give in to fear. He didn't know exactly what he would do with it, but he was certain he needed to remember. The notebook became his silent ally, hidden under his pillow like a talisman. If this kind of story grips you as Ethan's own records gripped him, leave your like here on the video. It shows you want more content like this. That same week, David decided to announce the engagement. It was during a simple dinner of pasta and soda that he pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it before Emily's teary eyes. She feigned surprise, cried, said yes with her hand on her chest, and embraced David with enthusiasm that seemed lifted from a movie. Ethan watched from the end of the table, feeling his stomach churn. When his stepmother looked at him and said, "Now we're a real family," he barely managed to respond. David, oblivious to the tension, took his son's hand and said that everything would be different from then on. Ethan smiled back, a polite smile that hid a growing confusion. Inside him, something screamed. He wanted to believe his father, wanted to trust that promise of a new beginning. But everything inside him said something was about to go terribly wrong, and for the first time, he seriously considered that no one would come to save him. He would have to do it himself. The routine changed in the days following the engagement announcement. Emily began spending more time at home, saying she wanted to prepare the home for the new phase. She redecorated Ethan's room without asking his opinion, replacing his hero posters with generic framed quotes and hiding his toys in donation boxes. The boy tried to protest, but heard a "now there will be order here" in a tone that didn't match the smile she wore in front of David. The feeling of being gradually erased grew with every small gesture, every change made without his voice being heard. Ethan started walking around more quietly, alert to everything. When she was alone with him, the sweet words gave way to dry disdain, disguised as irony. "It's impressive how you can be so useless," she would murmur as she passed him in the hallway, and even with fear in his chest, he recorded it all. It was like piecing together a puzzle without yet knowing what image would form in the end. One Saturday afternoon, while David shopped at the market, Emily and Ethan were alone. He was drawing at the living room table when she approached with a tray of juice and cookies. Ethan thanked her warily, but before he could take the glass, she nudged his drawing with her elbow, deliberately spilling juice on it. "You call that art? It looks like it was made by a blind baby," she said in a muffled laugh. He froze. It wasn't the first time she belittled him, but that remark hurt more. Not for the rudeness, but for the contempt in her eyes, as if he were an annoyance she was forced to endure. Ethan gathered the soggy paper, fighting back tears, and climbed to his room without a word. Deep down, he began to understand that he was dealing with someone dangerous, but it was still hard to accept that his father saw nothing of it. That night, David came home excited, bringing chocolate chip ice cream, Ethan's favorite. The three sat around the kitchen table, and for a few minutes everything seemed normal. Emily smiled, complimented the flavor choice, told funny work stories, as if nothing had happened hours before. Ethan watched in silence, trying to understand how someone could change faces so quickly. When David got up to take a call in the hallway, Emily leaned over the table and whispered venomously, "If you tell him anything, I'll say you made it all up because you miss your mother, and your father will believe me, not you." Ethan's blood ran cold. It was the first direct threat, and he felt the weight of being alone in that maze. When his father returned smiling, talking about a possible Sunday outing, Ethan forced a smile back, swallowing the urge to scream. He realized then that he needed more than memories and notes. He needed proof. The next day, while David washed the car in the garage, Emily went out for a walk, and Ethan had a rare chance to act. He grabbed his father's tablet and dashed into her room, heart pounding. He rifled through her dresser drawer and found a folder with loose papers, old photos, and something that caught his eye. A copy of a life insurance policy listing David as the insured and Emily as the beneficiary. The amount was staggering, over 1 million reais. He snapped photos with his phone, hidden in his sweatshirt pocket, trying not to leave traces. Before leaving, he even spotted an envelope filled with photos of her and an unknown man in different places, almost always holding hands. One of them wore a gold watch engraved with the initials MC on the band. Ethan stored that image like a code to decipher. He returned to his room, convinced he was entering territory much larger than he imagined, but also with the strange feeling that, for the first time, he was gaining some control over the situation. That same night, Ethan barely slept. What had been a silent fear now took on real, concrete shape. He lay staring at the ceiling, heart racing, phone hidden under his pillow, as if the photos inside were the only thing keeping his father alive. Around 3 in the morning, he heard footsteps in the hallway. The door creaked slightly and he pretended to be asleep. He felt Emily's presence at the door for a few seconds, long enough to chill his spine. Then the footsteps receded. He waited a few minutes before slipping out of bed and tiptoeing down to the living room. He sat on the sofa, hugging his knees, and began to think about how he could show all this to David without it seeming like a child's fantasy. The anguish wasn't just fear of what Emily might do, but doubt. What if his father didn't believe him again? What if he, once more, chose love for her over the truth told by his own son? It was on that dawn, between the silence of the house and the distant bark of a dog in the street, that Ethan made a decision. He needed proof no one could deny, and for that he would have to go beyond the photos. The next morning, he woke before everyone else, as if his body knew something important was about to happen. He feigned having a cold and asked not to go to school. David, worried, let him stay. As soon as the two left, the father for work, Emily for a medical appointment, Ethan raced back to her room. This time, he targeted her laptop. He tried the usual password, her name, then his father's name, and then, on a hunch, typed Brandon, the name of a dog she'd mentioned having in childhood. It worked. The computer unlocked with a soft click, revealing a desktop organized too neatly for someone who claimed to live in chaos. Then he saw it, a folder named Legal Documents, another labeled Trip 23, and further down a shortcut to an email account with Sarah W. in the corner. Ethan's blood ran like lightning. Sarah? With trembling hands, he clicked the email shortcut. The inbox was full of recent messages, exchanged with someone named Mark C. All he had to do was open one to confirm his worst fears. Once we're married, I hope it won't take long to arrange the accident. The insurance has been approved. The sentence hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened another. Remember to leave the pills in the bathroom drawer, darling. We'll use Plan B if he changes the will. Each new message was a piece of the truth he so feared, but also the proof he needed. There were attachments, photos of the two of them together in hotels, conversations detailing the wedding plans, schedules, even escape routes. Ethan took screenshots of everything. He couldn't describe the mix of rage and relief he felt. On one hand, it hurt terribly to know his father was sleeping beside someone plotting his murder. On the other, the certainty that he wasn't crazy, that what he saw, felt, and suspected was real, gave him strength to continue. In the Trip 23 folder, he found reservations for a hotel in Las Vegas, under the names Sarah Wallace and Mark Connor. It was like opening a window into Emily's true identity. She was not only cruel, she was a complete fraud. Ethan saved everything onto an old flash drive he found in the sock drawer and hid it deep in his school backpack, inside a torn pencil case. When he finished, he cleared all traces from the computer, carefully closed everything, and raced back to his room, trying to act normal before she returned. Still breathless, he looked at himself in the mirror. Pale face, deep dark circles under his eyes, narrowed eyes. He was no longer the same boy from a few weeks ago. For the first time, he realized how much he had changed. Not outwardly, but inwardly. He had become someone carrying too great a secret, someone who needed to be stronger than he thought possible. And even with fear, he knew he couldn't stop there. In the following days, Ethan moved with more caution than ever. He watched Emily like a silent investigator, noting every change. In her tone of voice, every rehearsed gesture in front of David. It was no longer just fear he felt, it was strategy. When she laughed too loudly at his father's jokes or feigned surprise at simple gifts, he mentally recorded the performance. At night, he locked his bedroom door, slept with his phone charged beside him, and the flash drive hidden in his pillowcase. One evening, while pretending to watch TV with the two of them in the living room, Emily placed her hand on his shoulder in apparent affection, but squeezed his skin tightly with her fingers. Ethan didn't react. He simply lifted his eyes and met her gaze with a cold calm, as if to say, "I know everything." For a moment, she froze too. There was a brief, heavy silence, as if both understood that the game had crossed its limits. But even with so much proof, doubt still gnawed at him. Would his father believe him? That question hammered in his mind day after day. He had tried before, small attempts, disguised confessions, clues, dropped in conversation. But David, enamored, always brushed them off. "She's trying, son. Give her a chance." Or, "I know you miss your mother, but Emily isn't trying to replace her." He spoke with such genuine warmth it hurt. Ethan never had the courage to respond harshly, nor to show everything he had discovered, until one day, leafing through the notebook where it all began, he saw on the last page something he himself had written weeks before. "If I don't do anything, no one will," he read. That phrase like a command. He decided then he wouldn't wait for anyone else to act for him. The wedding was set for the coming Saturday, and that would be his last chance. The wedding week felt like walking through a minefield. The house filled with boxes, bags of artificial flowers, golden ribbons, and a white dress hung on Emily's door like a ghost waiting for its cue. David seemed radiant. He managed the details with youthful enthusiasm, sent excited messages to friends, spoke of a fresh start. Ethan watched everything with a knot in his stomach. He tried to talk to his father one last time, on the night before the ceremony. He showed part of the photos, told about the emails, begged him at least to look closely. But David, stunned, reacted with disbelief. "This can't be true, Ethan. Not Emily." And as if trying to protect himself more than his son, he refused to see the rest. Ethan stood in the doorway, holding his phone with the files open, while his father turned away, frustrated, saying he was confusing everything out of fear of losing someone else. And at that moment, the boy understood. It was useless to try to convince in secret. He needed to expose everything in broad daylight. On the wedding morning, Ethan woke early, put on the outfit his father had laid out, a blue dress shirt, black trousers and shoes that pinched his heels, and went downstairs for breakfast. Emily was already ready, gliding through the house with light steps, hair in a delicate bun, pearl earrings, and a strong perfume that made him want to cough. She looked at him with a triumphant smile. "You look handsome today," she said, lightly touching his shoulder. Ethan just nodded and continued stirring his cereal. Inside, his stomach churned. He mentally checked his school backpack, where the flash drive and a spare phone with copies were hidden. He knew he had to stay calm and wait for the right moment. In the church, surrounded by smiling, distracted faces, he realized only he knew the truth. Only he saw the abyss behind those flowers and smiles. It was now or never. The ceremony began punctually at 10 a.m. The church, decorated with white flowers and golden lights, was filled with smiling guests, phones in hand, ready to capture every moment. Ethan sat in the front row beside a distant aunt, his palms sweaty, heart racing. David entered first, wearing a dark suit and teary eyes, greeting friends and relatives with an emotional smile. Then came Emily to the sound of soft music, walking down the aisle with her gaze fixed on the altar and her face hidden behind a light veil that barely concealed her triumphant air. Everything seemed perfect, almost cinematic, but to Ethan, each second was a countdown. His plan was clear in his mind. He would wait until the officiant said, "If anyone here has any reason why this union should not take place," and then he would stand and reveal everything. The mere thought made his stomach churn, but he knew he had no choice. Speak now or remain silent forever, and watch his father die at the hands of the woman who pretended to love him. When the officiant reached the expected point in the ceremony, silence fell over the church. "If anyone here present knows of any reason why this marriage should not occur," the words echoed like hammer blows in Ethan's chest. He stood, legs trembling, and raised his hand. At first, no one understood. His aunt tried to pull him back to the pew, but he freed his arm and walked down the central aisle. "I have," he said firmly, despite his fear. Gazes turned to him, first with curiosity, then with astonishment. "She is not who she claims to be. Her name is not Emily. It's Sarah Wallace, and she's lying to all of you. She wants to kill my father." The murmur in the church swelled into a loud buzz. Some people laughed, others widened their eyes. David stepped forward, confused. Emily, still at the altar, slowly turned as if it were impossible this was happening. But she said, "Nothing yet." Ethan walked to the altar with steady steps, even though his knees trembled inside. He took his phone from his pocket and, before everyone, opened the photo gallery. He showed the pictures of Emily with the mysterious man, the emails, the conversations with Mark. "She was going to kill my father after the wedding, stage an accident. All this here proves it." The church plunged into a strange silence, as if time had stopped for a few seconds. David took the phone from his sons, hands, eyes scanning the messages, trembling fingers swiping the screen. Emily tried to approach, but he held up his hand in a gesture of retreat. "This is a lie, isn't it? Tell me it's a lie," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Emily then stepped to the microphone and, in a still, sweet voice, claimed it was a misunderstanding, an invention of a traumatized child. But the congregation no longer seemed convinced, and her face, which once radiated control, began to crumble. Ethan stood beside his father, breathing hard, awaiting the next blow. Emily tried to regain control of the situation, saying it was a setup, that maybe someone was trying to separate them. But a relative of David's shouted, "Show the email then! Open it here!" The demand spread like wildfire. Pressured, Emily turned to David and reached for his arm, but he recoiled again. "Who is Mark, Emily?" he asked, voice hard with disappointment. The name sounded like a verdict. She froze for a few seconds. Then, something inside her snapped. The serene mask turned to rage. Her eyes flashed. "You're all idiots!" she screamed, yanking the microphone from its stand. "I spent months building this. He would have died happy, never noticing." Panic replaced the silence. A couple stood abruptly. Others began to back away from the pews. And in front of everyone, Emily dropped the microphone on the floor and bolted out the back of the church. What followed was controlled chaos. David, in shock, remained at the altar, eyes fixed on the door through which Emily had vanished. Ethan stayed beside him, unsure whether to embrace his father or simply wait for the dust to settle. One of the groomsmen chased after her, but returned saying she had escaped by car before anyone could stop her. The police were summoned immediately. Meanwhile, guests tried to process what they had witnessed. It was as if everyone had awakened from a beautiful dream into a nightmare. The sweet, charming woman who had captivated everyone for months had revealed herself as a fraud before their eyes. David, pale-faced, descended from the altar slowly and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Everything had been said. It was as though an entire layer of reality had been stripped away, leaving only the two of them, father and son, alone again, but now united by something stronger than before. A few hours later at the police station, David gave his statement while Ethan waited. Outside, seated on a blue plastic chair, an officer brought him a cup of water, which he barely touched to his lips. Adrenaline still coursed through his veins. An inspector emerged from the room and urgently called David. Emily's accomplice, identified as Mark Connor, had been located in a city hotel thanks to a tip from the front desk, who recognized the alias on the reservation. When officers arrived, they found forged documents, tickets purchased for both, and the same gold watch from the photos in the room. Mark tried to flee, but was captured in an emergency exit with a packed suitcase and a hidden gun in his luggage compartment. The confirmation of everything Ethan had uncovered hit like a blow and a relief. Now, there were no doubts. David, emerging from the interrogation room, looked at his son as if seeing him for the first time. Not as a child, but as someone who had saved him from death. This time, he hugged him tightly. In the days that followed, the house that once echoed. Forced voices and false footsteps sank into a genuine silence, but at last an honest one. David spent much of his time trying to process it all. He read and reread the printed emails, the flash drive files, the police reports. Sometimes he simply sat on the sofa staring into space. Ethan, by contrast, seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but also more alert, older, as though he had aged several years in a matter of days. They didn't talk much at first. There was a mood of mourning, but different from after his mother's death. It was a mourning for lost trust, for a dream torn apart by force. One night, while washing dishes together in silence, David finally said, "Forgive me, son. I failed you. I wanted so badly to believe someone could fill that void that I didn't see what was right in front of me." Ethan didn't reply immediately. He just looked at his father, dried a plate, and calmly said, "You didn't fail. You just forgot to listen." His son's response resonated throughout the night. David didn't sleep well, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't fear or guilt keeping him awake. It was reflection. He thought about how many times he had ignored small signs, the moments he chose to rationalize Emily's behavior, and how his own silence had been an ally of the tragedy. In the days that followed, he began to observe Ethan with new eyes, the way he thought before speaking, the notebooks full of notes, how he cared for the balcony plants, a legacy of his mother. He realized his son carried a rare sensitivity, something he himself had failed to protect. It was then he decided to seek help. He contacted a therapist specializing in family trauma and scheduled sessions for both of them. He didn't want all that to become another burden in the boy's life. He wanted, for the first time, to face what was truly difficult, rebuilding trust between them, not with promises, but with presence. Therapy sessions began discreetly, almost timidly. Ethan sat curled up in a corner of the white-walled room, while the therapist, a soft-spoken woman with thick-rimmed glasses, guided conversations with patience. David, for his part, seemed uncomfortable at first, as if occupying space that didn't belong to him. But over time, they both began to open up. Ethan spoke of sleepless nights, disguised shoves, cutting words he heard and stored. He told how he felt invisible, how he doubted himself, and how all that almost made him give up. David listened with teary eyes, but without interrupting. When it was his turn, he confessed he felt ashamed for not protecting his own son, for choosing the comfort of a lie over the hardness of a child's truth. The therapist listened attentively, but it was in her gaze toward Ethan that the boy found something he hadn't seen in a long time: recognition. As weeks passed, something began to change between father and son. It wasn't an explosive transformation, the kind you see in movies, but a subtle process, almost invisible to outsiders. David started including Ethan in household decisions, asking his opinion on small matters like what to cook for dinner or which movie to watch on Sunday. He let him guide moments instead of trying to conduct everything as before. Ethan, in turn, began to trust his own feelings more, speaking more clearly and without fear of seeming too sensitive. One afternoon, coming home from school, he found his father assembling a small new cabinet in the hallway. "I need a brave assistant. Know anyone?" he asked. Ethan smiled, dropped his backpack, and sat next to him without a word. They didn't need grand speeches. It was in that simple, present-filled routine that trust slowly rebirthed, not as before, but as something even stronger. A few months later, life finally seemed to follow a new rhythm. David returned to work part-time, while Ethan resumed school with greater confidence. He no longer avoided classmates, nor hid in the back rows of the classroom. He began participating more often, returned to drawing, and even joined the comic book club. The school principal, who had heard in passing about what happened, suggested he present one of his stories at the cultural fair. Ethan hesitated at first, but agreed. He created a comic where the hero had no cape, no superpowers, only the courage to tell the truth, even when no one believed him. When he presented it at school, everyone applauded, but for him, the best moment was seeing his father in the audience, smiling with tears in his eyes. That was the first time he felt proud of having faced it all, not for defeating a villain, but for refusing to stay silent. Despite the progress, a shadow still lingered in their thoughts. Emily remained at large. After the scandal at the church and Mark's arrest, the police issued an international arrest warrant. Her photos circulated on crime news sites, but no concrete leads emerged for months. For David, her absence was both a relief and an annoyance. Part of him wanted it to end once and for all. The other feared reliving everything if she reappeared. Ethan, however, dealt with the situation differently. He kept the memories, but refused to be defined by them. He had learned that fear is like an unwanted visitor. It knocks, insists, but can be ignored if you stand firm. And even though he occasionally woke from nightmares, he always found his way back to calm in his father's arms. 6 months after the interrupted wedding on June, a sultry Tuesday afternoon, David received an unexpected call from the Las Vegas police. Emily had been found dead in a cheap hotel room, registered under another alias. The scene indicated an overdose, but what caught their attention was a handwritten note found beside the body. The letter, penned in a familiar hand and mixing rage with remorse, confessed the plot, involvement with Mark, and other prior schemes, but stated that things had been different with David. "For a while, I really thought I could change," read one passage. To the police, it was the end of a complex case. To David and Ethan, it was another whirlwind to process. The news hit like a stone thrown into the lake that was finally calming. David hung up the phone without a word and stood for long minutes by the window, staring at the grey sky, unable to think. When he told Ethan that night, he braced for any reaction: anger, fear, relief. But the boy merely nodded. "She really died?" he asked. David confirmed. "So, it's really over now?" he persisted. David hesitated. "I think so. At least this chapter." The ensuing silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the end of a difficult chapter you reread just to be sure it's finished. In the days that followed, they returned to routine with lighter hearts, though carrying invisible marks. Marks that no longer hurt as before, but remained to remind them what they had overcome together. Ethan, now newly 9, was no longer the same boy who had once doubted in silence. He was steadier, more alert, but without losing his sweetness. And David, once so lost trying to fill the void of loss, finally understood that his greatest chance at a new beginning had been right there beside him all along. Over time, they created new rituals to replace old silences. On Saturdays, they made pancakes together and invented names for each: Tower of the Invincible, Circle of Truth, Ethan's Shield. On Wednesdays, David picked up his son early from school, and they spent an hour in the neighborhood bookstore, where Ethan could choose one new book a month. It was a way to reconnect unhurriedly, without obligation. One day, returning home, Ethan remarked casually, "Did you know that when I was afraid to sleep, I pretended my bed was a boat? So if she came in, the boat would already have set sail." David swallowed hard. He wanted to respond then and there, to say he was sorry, that he should have noticed, but he chose simply to listen. That simple, spontaneous comment spoke volume. In that moment, he understood something essential. Ethan no longer needed apologies. He needed presence, someone truly willing to listen. On a rainy late afternoon, while watching an old movie on the sofa, David fell asleep with his head resting on his son's shoulder. Ethan smiled at the scene. It was funny how, after everything, their roles had reversed. For so long, he had felt small and defenseless. Now, seeing his father asleep, he felt he could protect him too. The feeling was new, comforting. In the background, the rain tapping the window lulled that silent yet meaningful moment. Ethan reached out, pulled the blanket over them both, and settled in. On the TV screen, the film played on, but inside the living room, time seemed to stand still. It was in such small, seemingly trivial moments that their life regained its center. They no longer needed grand gestures, just each other. And that, at last, was enough. As the year's end approached, David decided to take a small trip with Ethan. Nothing grand, just a weekend in a neighboring town with easy trails and a simple lakeside cabin. It was their first trip since everything happened, and that was precisely the point. To leave home, breathe different air, and create new memories together. During the hike, Ethan picked up some unusual stones and said he wanted to build a terrarium when they returned. "To care for something alive that won't leave," he explained. David fell silent for a few seconds and then replied, with a discreet smile, "Then we'll care for it together." That night they fell asleep to the sound of crickets and running water, and for the first time in a long while, David had a peaceful dream, a wide-open field with his son running ahead, laughing freely, never looking back. When he woke to sunlight streaming through the window, he understood the message. It was time to truly move forward. Upon their return, they built the terrarium. Ethan selected the glass container, the stones, the moss, and even a small plant he named Resilience. It was a simple, almost childlike activity, but filled with meaning. With each layer they added, it felt as though they buried a bit of old pain and made space for something new. David hung the little vase on the balcony alongside the plants he'd carefully kept alive since Ethan's mother's accident. That blend of past and present in the same spot reminded them that life doesn't need to erase what was to begin anew. It just needs room. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. It's not about forgetting or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about growing around the pain, just as plants grow around rocks in the soil. The difference now was that together, they were watering what truly mattered. With the new school year looming, Ethan returned to classes with a different outlook. Teachers noticed the change in the first week. He participated more, smiled often, even joked during breaks. It was as if something inside him had untied. One day, during an activity about real-life heroes, he raised his hand and said the greatest hero he knew was his father. The classroom fell silent for a second, then the teacher smiled and asked him to explain. "Because he believed me, even when it was hard." The words came effortlessly, but carried a weight only he could bear. David learned of it through a note from the school, and when he read it, he took several minutes to hold back tears, realizing that, despite everything, he was still his son's hero. That, more than any medal, restored the strength he thought he had lost. In the nights that followed, they began keeping a journal together. It wasn't formal or obligatory. They'd sit in the living room after dinner and write whatever came to mind. A memory, a story from the day, a stray thought. David wrote in large, spaced handwriting. Ethan in firmer, quicker strokes. Sometimes they'd draw too. It became a ritual, a space just for them. And amidst those unstructured pages, they began, recording not only what they experienced, but what they hoped to live moving forward. Next trip, beach. learn to make pancakes by myself, watch a movie without falling asleep halfway through. Small goals, big dreams. And between one page and the next, they sketched out a new life, built without haste but with honesty, because now they knew, no matter how dark the path, when you have someone by your side, you always find the way out. One evening, while revisiting old notes hidden in a drawer, Ethan found the notebook where he had recorded everything about Emily, or rather Sarah. He leafed through the yellowed pages, heart tightening at each phrase, each piece of evidence scrawled by the trembling hands of a boy, unsure if anyone would listen. He read the phrase on the last page, "If I don't do anything, no one will," and closed his eyes for a moment. That notebook, once a symbol of fear and resistance, now seemed like a distant memory of who he had been. He descended to the living room, clutching the notebook, and handed it to his father, who received it in silence. "You can throw it away if you want," Ethan said. But David just ran his hand over the cover without opening it and replied, "No, this saved my life. We keep it so we never forget how brave you were." And then he placed the notebook in a wooden box alongside other important keepsakes, a photo of Ethan's mother, old drawings, diary notes, a time capsule that one day might be opened again. Over time, the bad memories began to lose space, not because they were erased, but because better ones took their place. The first time they went to the movies after everything, they laughed so hard at a silly comedy that they left with stomachaches. At the neighborhood fair, they invented names for different fruits as if they were characters. "This one looks like a fierce general," Ethan would say, pointing at a star fruit. David laughed heartily, unabashed. Little by little, they filled their lives with genuine joy, the kind that needs no announcement, only living. Even their silences changed tone. Once heavy, now they were light. When they were quiet, it was because they were comfortable. When they looked at each other, it wasn't with mistrust, but with certainty. And so, without grand speeches, they rebuilt what they had lost. A bond made not only of blood, but of daily choice. One sunny Sunday, while organizing the laundry room closet, David found a box he hadn't seen in years. Inside were keepsakes from when Ethan was a baby, clothes, toys, a letter his mother wrote shortly before she died. David sat on the floor and called Ethan. "There's something here I think you're ready to read." Gently, he handed the letter to his son and waited in silence. Ethan read slowly, eyes tracing those old words full of love and hope. His mother spoke of love, trusting one's intuition, and believing that, even without her, his father would do his best to raise him with honesty. When he finished, Ethan's eyes were misty. David's were too. It was a silent but profound moment. It was as if in some way his mother had left a reminder that they could and should move forward. That night, Ethan placed the letter inside the journal he shared with his father. He said nothing, just slipped it between the pages, as if integrating it into the new story they were building. And David understood. It was a way to unite past and present without erasing either. From that point on, they began to mention his mother more naturally. Not as a wound, but as part of life. They talked about her favorite recipes, the songs she sang off-key in the car, and the stories she improvised at bedtime. And the more they talked, the lighter it became. Ethan no longer carried the burden of pretending he was okay, and David no longer felt guilty for not having done everything right. They had finally grasped that loving someone doesn't mean never making mistakes, but being willing to make amends when you do. And it was that understanding that sealed their new chapter, based on something no lie could destroy: trust. At school, a new assignment prompted Ethan to reflect once more on all he had lived. The class was to write an essay on what it means to be brave. While some classmates wrote about firefighters, athletes, or movie characters, Ethan sat in silence for long minutes. When he finally began to write, the words flowed effortlessly, as if they had been waiting inside him all along. Being brave isn't about fighting monsters or wielding swords. Sometimes it's telling the truth, even when everyone thinks you're making it up. Being brave is feeling fear and going anyway. It's protecting someone you love, even when no one believes you. The teacher was so moved by the text that she read it aloud to the class with Ethan's permission. For the first time, he didn't feel ashamed. He felt proud, not for the recognition, but for finally giving voice to what he carried within. David read the essay that same night, and rereading it was like traveling back in time, but with the security of knowing the worst was behind them. He hugged his son, looked into his eyes and said, "You're the bravest boy I've ever known." Ethan smiled with a knowing expression. Only someone who has weathered a storm can wear. They continued writing in the journal, now more frequently, and began planning their next trip. A visit to the coast where Ethan wanted to see the ocean for the first time. "I want to know if the sound of the waves is like my imaginary boat," he joked. David laughed and promised they would make that trip happen, not as an escape from the past, but as a well-deserved gift. Because after so much fear, so much pain, and so much doubt, it was time for hope. And this time, it was real. The trip to the coast took place the following month, and it was more than a simple change of scenery. It was a confirmation of all they had rebuilt together. Ethan ran across the sand, as if trying to reach the horizon with his own feet, and David watched him with a mix of joy and relief. When they reached the water's edge, the boy stood still for a few seconds, simply listening to the sound of the waves. "It really is like the little boat," he said softly. Then he stepped into the shallow water, splashed his feet, jumped the small waves, and laughed out loud. David joined him moments later, and they spent the afternoon playing as if there were no past, guilt, or scars. That night, sitting on a simple porch, they ate fried fish and shared a pineapple slush. Ethan scribbled on a napkin, "Best day ever." David tucked the paper into his wallet without a word. He didn't need to. Returning home, their days resumed their usual pace, but with a new kind of calm. It wasn't the forced peace they had known with Emily, but a genuine serenity built on truth. The case was officially closed, Mark was imprisoned, and Sarah's, Emily's name, gradually disappeared from public records. Still, sometimes, memories flickered like flashes, a stray phrase, a scent, an out-of-place object. But unlike before, they knew how to handle it. They talked, they shared, and they moved on. Once, Ethan found an old photo of his stepmother hidden among his father's papers. Instead of being scared or silent, he simply showed it and asked, "Should we throw it away or keep it to remember what we overcame?" David smiled, took the photo, looked at it for a few seconds, and tore it into 4 pieces. "We remember enough already. Now it's time to move forward." And they did. Now tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Ethan's place? Your opinion can open the door to many important conversations here. Over time, the story that began as a nightmare became something father and son only spoke of when truly meaningful. Without anger, without pain, just as a difficult chapter that, thankfully, had ended. Ethan grew more confident, more curious, and became interested in technology. He learned to program small games and said that in the future he wanted to create apps to help children protect themselves. Like an invisible emergency button that only the child can see and use if they're in danger, he explained enthusiastically. David listened in admiration, impressed by his son's ability to turn such a harsh experience into something useful. He knew he couldn't erase what happened, but he could ensure it served a purpose. And it seemed Ethan already understood that better than he did. One weekend, David was called to a meeting at school. The coordinator wanted to talk about a project Ethan had proposed on his own initiative, a support group for students who felt alone or unsafe at home. Nothing formal, just a space for conversation and listening. David listened with misty eyes, remembering when his own son used to stay silent for fear of not being taken seriously. The coordinator said she had never seen a student so young speak with such maturity. When he returned home, David didn't say anything immediately. He just entered Ethan's room, saw him focused on a drawing at the computer, and stood there watching. He thought about how that boy was made of silent strength, rare sensitivity, and a courage often lacking in adults. And at that moment, he was certain his son had not just survived, he had been transformed. That same evening before bed, David suggested something new, that they write a letter together, as if speaking to another child going through something similar to what Ethan experienced. The boy agreed immediately. They sat at the kitchen table with sheets of paper and colored pens. Ethan began in firm handwriting. If you're reading this and feel like no one believes you, don't give up. Sometimes adults get confused, but you know what you feel, and that matters. David added, you are not alone. Your courage can save someone. It can save you. The letter stayed taped to the refrigerator door for days. Later, it was placed in the journal. Alongside his mother's letter, the school note and their plans. The message they left was simple but powerful. The pain we endure can become help for someone else, as long as we don't hide what we feel. And, most importantly, as long as someone is willing to listen. Weeks later, at a school event, Ethan was invited to speak about the support group he created. He climbed the stage shyly, but with steady posture. He began telling a story without names, without saying it was about him. He said a boy lived in fear for a long time, tried to speak up, but no one listened. And one day, he spoke out loud, in front of everyone, and saved a life. The audience was silent. Then, as if in a collective sigh, they began to applaud. David watched from the front row, standing, not as someone clapping out of pride, but as someone recognizing the greatness of something real. When Ethan came down from the stage, he looked at his father and smiled. I think I finally understood what it means to start. Over? David placed his hand on his shoulder and replied, and you taught me how. And there, amid looks and applause, they closed another chapter, not with a period, but with ellipses full of possibilities. Life went on, as it does when you're brave enough to let it continue. Ethan entered middle school 2 years ahead, thanks to his academic and emotional performance. He was still the same curious, observant boy, but now he walked with firmer steps, as someone who knows exactly where he's treading. At school meetings, it was common to hear teachers say, there's something different about him, a maturity that impresses. David would smile quietly, recalling every detail that shaped that something different. He knew it wasn't luck. It was the fruit of pain, courage, resilience, and much love. And above all, the choice they made together, not to stay silent, even when it would have been easier to pretend everything was fine. At the end of that year, while decorating the Christmas tree, Ethan hung a new ornament, a small wooden boat with hope carved by hand. David looked at his son, moved but speechless. It was the same kind of silence they had shared so many times, but now it was a silence full of peace. The tree lights reflected in the windows, and between one Christmas carol and another, David found himself thinking of all they had faced. He no longer felt guilt, only gratitude. Gratitude for being saved by his own son, for having the chance to begin again, and for learning to truly listen. And there on that simple night, surrounded by lights and memories, it became clear. It wasn't the past that defined who they were. It was how they chose to walk through it. And, above all, how they chose to keep going. With the start of a new year, David and Ethan decided to begin a project together, writing a book telling their story, but in a way accessible to other children. Nothing sensationalist, nothing too sad, just the truth, told with the care of those who lived it and survived. Gradually, they organized the chapters. Ethan wrote the memories through the eyes of a child in the midst of chaos. David wrote as someone who learned to become a real father after almost losing everything. The book had no deadline. It was a living project that grew with them. More than a publication, it was an exercise in healing. And perhaps one day it would also help other parents and children see what isn't always visible, that sometimes the one who saves you is the one you least expect. One ordinary Wednesday evening over dinner, Ethan asked his father, if you could go back in time, would you change anything? David thought for a few seconds before replying, I would change how long it took me to listen to you. That's it. Ethan nodded. as if he already knew, and without looking up from his plate said, "It's okay, because when you listened, you really listened." The phrase hung in the air, a blessing over the table. There was no resentment, only understanding, and that's how they carried on. Through simple conversations, re-signified memories and honest plans. They no longer expected perfection, they only expected presence, truth, and partnership. And in that quiet, vibrant home, that was more than enough. Today, years later, David still keeps the old notebook, the school note, the napkin with "best day ever," and the wooden boat on the Christmas tree, even out of season. Ethan is now a teenager with his own ideas, firm opinions, and a sense of justice that continues to inspire everyone around him. They keep writing the book little by little, recalling not only what they endured, but everything they've built since. The story no longer hurts as it once did, and although scars remain, they no longer dictate their days. They are simply reminders of the path they walked, a difficult road full of detours and holes, but one they chose to cross together. And that choice, made repeatedly, remains what matters most. Ethan's story was never about being a victim. It has always been about courage, about the strength of a child who refused to be silenced, even when the world told him to shut up, and about a father who learned, albeit late, that listening is the greatest act of love. They don't live as heroes. They live as ordinary people who decided not to run from what was hard. And because of that, they became giants for each other. Today, if someone asks Ethan what he learned from it all, his answer is simple and direct: that the truth saves, even when it hurts. And it is with that phrase displayed on his bedroom wall and in the hearts of those who have heard it that their story continues. No fantasy, no forced happy ending, just reality, strong, harsh, beautiful, of those who survived and chose to live better. If this story truly moved you, share it with someone who also needs to believe there is a new beginning, even after the chaos.